It was one of those calm Saturday afternoons when the streets moved at their own lazy pace. The sky was clear, the air had that quiet hum of weekend ease, and everyone seemed to be in no particular rush. On that day, a well-respected police captain decided to stop by a local department store not far from her neighborhood. She had been working long hours that week and wanted to pick up a few things before heading home. Dressed casually in jeans, a light jacket, and sneakers, she looked just like any other person running errands. She parked her car in a corner spot, locked it, and walked toward the glass doors that slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the smell of new clothes mixed with the faint scent of coffee from the small cafe by the entrance. She grabbed a shopping basket and began to move through the aisles, glancing at items without any rush. She picked out a few small things, a pack of socks, some toiletries, and a new wallet she'd been meaning to replace. While she walked, she noticed a few store employees moving around the aisles, folding clothes and greeting customers. Nothing seemed unusual, except for one security guard who seemed to be watching her a little too closely. She had noticed people like that before, staring a bit too long, pretending to check something nearby while really keeping an eye on her. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and she brushed it off, telling herself not to make assumptions. After all, she was there just like everyone else, shopping peacefully. As she made her way to the checkout line, her phone buzzed. It was a message from a colleague asking about a shift schedule. She replied quickly, paid for her items, and placed them neatly in a shopping bag. She smiled at the cashier, thanked them, and walked out the door. The sun hit her face as she stepped outside, and she took a deep breath, thinking about what to cook for dinner later that evening. But before she could reach her car, a voice called out sharply behind her, "Excuse me, ma'am. Can you stop for a moment?" She turned around to see the same security guard from inside approaching, his walk quick and serious. For a second, she thought maybe she had dropped something or left her wallet behind, but his tone didn't sound helpful, it sounded accusing. "Did you pay for those items?" he asked, pointing at her shopping bag. She blinked, surprised. "Yes, of course I did. You can check the receipt." The guard's expression hardened. "I'll need you to come back inside with me," he said. Something in his voice felt unnecessarily harsh, almost rehearsed. Shoppers nearby slowed down, curious. The woman could feel eyes on her, that uncomfortable weight of being watched. "I already paid," she said calmly. "You can look at the receipt right here." She held it up, but he didn't even glance at it. Instead, he reached for his radio and said something quietly, calling for backup. Within minutes, 2 police officers pulled up in their patrol car near the entrance. The flashing blue lights drew even more attention. The captain's heart sank. She knew exactly what this looked like, an arrest scene forming before it even began. The officers stepped out looking alert. "What's going on?" one of them asked the guard. "She tried to walk out with items she didn't pay for," the guard said confidently. "I saw her skip the register." "That's not true," she said firmly, keeping her voice steady. "I paid for everything. The receipt is right here in my hand." One of the officers took a step closer. "Ma'am, we'll need you to calm down." "I am calm," she replied, still holding the bag and the receipt. "I'm telling you, this is a misunderstanding." The second officer looked at her suspiciously, scanning her from head to toe. Maybe it was the casual clothes. Maybe it was the tone in her voice that made them assume defiance instead of confidence. She could sense the judgment in their eyes, the quiet presumption that she was guilty before she could even explain. "Ma'am, please put your bag down," the first officer said, his hand resting near his belt. She sighed softly and did as she was told. "I'm a police officer," she said, reaching for her wallet. "My identification is in here." But before she could open it, the first officer stepped forward quickly. "Don't reach for anything," he ordered sharply. She froze, lifting her hand slightly. "I'm just trying to show you my badge." "Put your hands where I can see them," he said again, his voice louder this time. People had gathered now, some filming, others whispering. She could feel her face grow warm. Not from guilt, but from humiliation. She had spent years serving her city, training younger officers to handle situations like this with empathy and calm. Yet here she was, treated like a threat for simply shopping. "Sir," she said carefully, "if you check the store cameras, you'll see me paying at the register." The security guard interrupted. She was at the self-checkout. Could have scanned fake barcodes or something. "That's ridiculous," she said quietly. "You can verify everything on the receipt." But the officers weren't listening. One of them moved closer, taking her arm. "We're just going to take you in to clear this up," he said. "Take me in?" She repeated, disbelief washing over her. "You're arresting me without checking the evidence?" "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Her heart pounded, not from fear but frustration. "This isn't right," she said softly, shaking her head. "You're making a mistake." Still, they turned her around and pulled her hands behind her back. The click of the cuffs was loud and final. Someone in the crowd gasped. She stared straight ahead, her eyes stinging, trying to hold on to her composure. "Let's go," one officer said. They led her toward the patrol car as she tried to keep her voice steady. "Please, at least check the cameras before this goes any further." But no one responded. Inside the car, she sat in silence, the metal cuffs cold against her wrists. Through the window, she could see the security guard standing proudly, talking to the officers who stayed behind. In his mind, he had done his job. To him, she was just another shoplifter caught in the act. As the car pulled away, she looked down at the badge clipped inside her wallet. She had carried that badge with pride for more than 20 years. It symbolized everything she believed in: justice, fairness, and respect. Yet at that moment, none of those things had protected her. The drive to the station felt longer than usual. Every sound seemed sharper. The radio static, the hum of the engine, the quiet murmur between the officers in the front. She wondered if they had any idea who she was. Part of her wanted to tell them again, to shout it, but another part of her wanted them to see their mistake first. At the precinct, they walked her inside like any other suspect. She saw the familiar walls, the same gray floor she had walked hundreds of times as an officer, but today she was on the other side of it, the side where people were presumed guilty before being heard. As they processed her information, she kept her voice calm. "Please look up my name. You'll understand soon." One officer frowned, typing something into the computer. The moment her profile appeared, his expression changed completely. He looked from the screen to her face, then back again. His jaw tightened and he slowly removed his hands from the keyboard. "Captain?" he asked quietly, disbelief in his voice. She nodded, her expression tired but steady. "Yes, Captain." The room went silent. The officers exchanged nervous glances, realizing what they had done. The one who had cuffed her took a step back, his face pale. "Ma'am, we didn't realize." She held up her hand gently. "Please don't say anything. Just take off the cuffs." He did, his hands trembling slightly. The metal loosened and dropped away with a faint clink. She rubbed her wrists slowly, the red marks faint but visible. The silence in the room grew heavy. No one seemed to know what to say. The captain looked at each of them, her expression unreadable. "This," she said quietly, "is exactly what I've been trying to stop." No one spoke. The truth of her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Later, when she sat alone in the small interview room, she looked down at her hands and thought about what had just happened. She had spent her career teaching others how to treat people with dignity, no matter who they were. And yet, when the moment came, even her own badge hadn't protected her from prejudice. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just sat there letting the reality settle in. Because deep down she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger, something that had been ignored for far too long. And that day, she realized something painful but true. Sometimes, it takes being treated unfairly to truly see how deeply bias runs, even in the place that should stand for justice. The air inside the station felt colder than usual, even though the heaters were running. The captain sat quietly on a bench near the front desk, her shopping bag placed beside her like a reminder of how quickly a normal day had turned upside down. Officers walked in and out, pretending not to stare, but she could feel their glances. Word had already started to spread through the building. The two officers who had brought her in stood a few feet away, whispering to each other. They avoided looking at her directly. The young officer at the computer tried to focus on his screen, but his hands trembled slightly on the keyboard. It was clear that no one quite knew what to do. After a few long minutes, the desk sergeant came out from his office. He was an older man, someone the captain had worked with for years. The moment he saw her sitting there, his step slowed, his eyebrows furrowed as confusion crossed his face. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp. The room went silent. The younger officer cleared his throat. "There was a shoplifting report from the department store. We brought her in." The sergeant's eyes darted from the officer to the captain. You brought her in? He looked back at the captain. You're saying they didn't recognize you? The captain's expression stayed calm, though her voice carried quiet disappointment. They didn't even check my badge, she said softly. The sergeant turned toward the arresting officers, his tone hardening. You didn't verify her ID before cuffing her? We were just following procedure, one of them said quickly. Store security called it in. They said, I don't care what they said, the sergeant interrupted. You still check before making an arrest. You should know better. The captain looked down at her hands, which still carried faint red marks from the cuffs. The memory of being pulled toward the patrol car replayed in her mind like a scene she couldn't turn off. She remembered the way people had stared at her, some whispering, some filming. She could almost hear their thoughts, thinking she was another thief caught stealing. The sergeant's voice broke her thoughts. You can go home, he said quietly. I'll handle this, but she didn't move. No, she said after a moment. I think I'll stay. He looked at her with concern. You don't have to, not tonight. I need to understand how this happened, she said. I need to see how something like this could go so wrong. The sergeant nodded slowly. He knew her well enough to understand that once she set her mind on something, she wouldn't let it go. He gestured for the officers to step outside the room. The captain sat there for a while, staring at the faint reflection of the overhead lights on the floor. Every sound in the station, the ringing phone, the chatter from another room, felt distant. After a few minutes, she stood up and walked toward the coffee machine by the hallway. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were racing. She wasn't angry in the way most people would expect. She was disappointed, deeply, personally disappointed. Because these weren't just random officers. They were part of the same system she had worked so hard to improve. She poured herself a cup of coffee, took a sip, and leaned against the counter. She thought about all the training sessions she had led over the years, the lectures on fairness and judgment, the conversations about community trust. She had always believed that change had to come from within the department. But now, sitting in that moment, she wondered if anyone had really listened. A few hours later, she finally decided to head home. The streets were quiet and the city lights blurred slightly through her windshield. She drove without music, lost in thought. When she reached home, she sat in the car for a while before going inside. Her house was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. She set her shopping bag on the kitchen table and stared at it. Those small items, so ordinary, had somehow led to one of the most humiliating moments of her life. She took a slow breath and finally opened her phone. The notifications were endless, calls, messages, and one text from a colleague that simply said, I saw the video. Are you okay? Her stomach dropped. Video? She whispered to herself. She opened the link attached to the message. Her heart sank as she saw it. A shaky phone video filmed by someone at the store. It showed her being handcuffed, her voice calm but firm, trying to explain that she was a police officer while the officers around her ignored her. The video had already spread online. Comments filled the screen. Some people were angry. Others were shocked. Some were even defending the officers, saying they were just doing their job. She put the phone down and closed her eyes. For years, she had read stories like this. Stories of people being treated unfairly because of assumptions or bias. But she had never imagined becoming one of them. The next morning, the news had already picked it up. Reporters stood outside the station asking questions. The department's public affairs officer was struggling to keep up with the growing attention. By the time she arrived at work, the whispers had turned into open conversation. Some officers nodded at her with sympathy. Others avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. A few still looked defensive, as if her experience was somehow an attack on them. The chief called her into his office. His face was serious, his tone careful. I've seen the footage, he said. We're opening an internal investigation. She nodded. Good, it's necessary. He leaned back in his chair. This is going to get a lot of attention. The media's already running with it. We need to handle this carefully. She looked at him steadily.
I understand.
But we also need to be honest about what it shows, he sighed. You know how complicated these things can get. Yes, she said, but that's the problem. They shouldn't be complicated. It's about right and wrong. The chief didn't reply for a long moment. Then he said quietly, You've been one of our best. I'm sorry this happened to you. Don't be sorry for me, she replied softly. Be sorry for what this says about us. As she left his office, she could feel the weight of the stairs again, some respectful, some uneasy. The department was uncomfortable, not just because of the mistake, but because the mistake had been caught on camera. Later that day, she met with the two officers who had arrested her. The meeting wasn't official. She had asked to speak with them privately. They looked nervous as they entered the small conference room. She stood by the window, her arms crossed. "Sit down," she said gently. They obeyed without a word. "I'm not here to yell," she began. "I want to understand what went through your minds that day." The younger officer spoke first. "We were called about a shoplifting report. The security guard said he saw someone leave without paying. We acted fast, I understand that," she said. "But why didn't you check the receipt when I offered it?" He looked down. "We've had people fake receipts before. And why didn't you believe I was a police officer when I told you?" she asked. The room went quiet. The older officer finally spoke. "It just didn't seem likely," he said slowly. "I mean, you didn't look like one." She tilted her head slightly. "Didn't look like one?" He swallowed hard. "I mean, we weren't expecting someone like me." She finished his sentence for him. He nodded weakly. She took a deep breath, not out of anger, but sadness. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You saw what you expected to see, not what was real. That's bias. You may not have meant harm, but the harm still happened." They didn't respond. Their silence said enough. She looked at them both. "I've trained dozens of officers on this exact issue. I've told you all that bias isn't just about hatred, it's about assumption. You assumed guilt before you looked for truth." After a moment, she added softly, "One day that kind of thinking could cost someone their life." Neither officer looked up. The weight of her words filled the room. When they left, she stayed by the window for a while, staring at the city below. She wasn't sure what would come next. The investigation, the press, the public reaction, it was all bigger than her now. But she knew this. She couldn't let the moment pass without meaning. That night, she sat at her desk and began to write. Not for the department, not for the news, but for herself. She wrote everything she remembered, every feeling, every detail, because she knew that the truth needed to be told, not out of anger, but out of hope that something good might come from it. She didn't know it then, but that simple act, telling her story, would soon turn into something much larger than she ever imagined. It wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. It was about showing how easily bias can slip into judgment, how quickly assumptions can replace facts, and how deeply those mistakes can hurt, even within the walls of justice itself. And as she finished writing, she whispered to herself, "This has to mean something. It can't just end here." The following week felt different inside the station. Conversations stopped whenever the captain walked by. Some people looked at her with quiet sympathy, others with guilt, and a few with silent resentment. The whole department was unsettled. What had happened wasn't just a mistake. It had exposed something people had tried not to talk about. The internal investigation had already begun. Officers were being questioned, statements taken, and surveillance footage reviewed. The captain wasn't angry at the process. She wanted it to happen. But she also knew that behind those walls, people were whispering things like, "It was just a misunderstanding," or "the officers didn't mean it that way." But intent didn't erase the truth. On a gray morning, she was called into a meeting with the internal affairs team. The conference room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. She sat across from two investigators she knew well. They greeted her politely but kept their tone professional. "Captain," one of them began, "we appreciate you coming in. We just need to walk through everything again from your perspective." She nodded. "I understand." They started with basic questions: what time she entered the store, what she bought, what happened when the security guard approached her. She answered calmly, describing everything in clear detail. Then came the harder questions. "Did you identify yourself as law enforcement?" "Yes," she said. "More than once." And their response? "They didn't believe me. They told me not to move, not to reach for anything. I tried to show my badge, but they stopped me." The second investigator leaned forward slightly. "Do you believe their actions were based on bias?" She took a slow breath before replying. "I believe their reaction was shaped by what they assumed about me before they knew who I was. That's bias, whether it's conscious or not." They scribbled notes but didn't look up. She knew they had to stay neutral. Still, she could sense that even they were uneasy. After the interview, she walked outside, the sun bright against the station's gray walls. A few reporters stood near the parking lot calling out questions, cameras flashing. She didn't respond. She just kept walking. At home that evening, she turned on the news. Her story was everywhere. The video had spread beyond the city. National networks were now showing it. Commentators debated it. People online shared their opinions, and the public demanded answers. Some said it proved the system was broken. Others said it was just one mistake being blown out of proportion. She turned off the TV. It wasn't the noise she cared about. What mattered to her was what would come after the noise, when the headlines faded and the real work began. A few days later, she received a call from the mayor's office. They wanted to meet. She agreed, though she knew what the conversation would be about. The next morning, she walked into City Hall. The mayor greeted her warmly, but there was tension in the air. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry for what you went through," the mayor said. "This shouldn't have happened." The captain nodded. "Thank you." "The city is under pressure," the mayor continued. "People want accountability. We're reviewing our training programs and looking into reforms. I wanted your input." She hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's not just about training," she said. "You can sit officers in a classroom for hours and talk about bias, but that doesn't change behavior unless the culture changes too." The mayor leaned forward. "And how do we change that culture?" "It starts with honesty," she replied. "We can't fix what we refuse to admit exists." There was silence. The mayor nodded slowly, understanding her point. "Would you be willing to help lead that change?" She thought about it. The idea of stepping into that role was heavy, but she knew this was her chance to make something meaningful out of what had happened. "Yes," she said finally. "If it helps prevent what happened to me from happening to someone else, I'll do it." That night, she sat in her living room with a notepad and began writing down ideas. She wanted to create something that went beyond lectures, something real. She imagined workshops where officers had to confront their assumptions, where they listened to people from different backgrounds, and where stories, not statistics, taught empathy. In the weeks that followed, she worked tirelessly. She met with community leaders, psychologists, and officers from other cities who had faced similar struggles. Slowly, she began shaping a new kind of training program, one focused not just on bias, but on awareness, communication, and understanding. But not everyone welcomed her effort. Some officers felt threatened. "So now we're the problem?" one of them muttered in the hallway one day. "She gets embarrassed in public and suddenly we all need retraining." She overheard it, but she didn't respond. She knew resistance was part of change. During one of her first sessions, she stood before a room full of officers. Some she'd worked with for years, others newer to the force. The atmosphere was tense. She began by sharing her story, not with anger, but with quiet honesty. "I wasn't angry when it happened," she told them. "I was hurt. Because I realized that if someone like me, someone in uniform, someone who served for decades, could be judged so quickly, what chance does an ordinary person have?" The room stayed silent. Some officers avoided eye contact, while others nodded slowly, understanding. "I'm not here to blame anyone," she continued. "I'm here because we all wear the same badge, and that means we have to hold each other accountable. Bias isn't about being a bad person. It's about being human. But when you wear this uniform, you don't get to act on bias. You have to rise above it." Her words stayed with many of them. For the first time, they weren't hearing about bias from a textbook or a policy manual. They were hearing it from one of their own. After the session, a few officers approached her privately. One of them, a quiet man from another division, said softly, "I didn't realize how much I assumed before I even talked to people." "What happened to you?" "It made me think," she smiled faintly. "That's where it starts," she said, "with thinking." Outside the department, her story continued to grow. Community groups invited her to speak at events. Schools asked her to talk to young people about justice and fairness. Everywhere she went, people wanted to hear how she had stayed calm and compassionate instead of angry. She always gave the same answer. Because anger doesn't build anything. Understanding does. One evening, months after the incident, she received a letter from a woman she didn't know. It read, "My son watched your story on the news. He used to be afraid of the police. But after hearing how you handled everything, he said, 'Maybe there are good ones out there too. Thank you for giving him hope.'" She sat there for a long time, holding the letter in her hands. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. It reminded her that what she was doing mattered, not just for officers, but for the people they served. As time went on, she noticed small changes in the department. Officers began talking more openly about their experiences, their mistakes, and their fears. The 2 officers who had arrested her even joined her program, volunteering to share their story as an example of learning from failure. One day, after a long training session, one of them approached her. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up on us." She looked at him with a gentle smile. "I never wanted to punish anyone," she said. "I just wanted you to see what I saw that day, the moment when judgment replaced understanding." The department still had a long way to go, but progress was finally visible. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't fast, but it was real, and for her that was enough. Late one night she sat in her office alone. The city lights shimmered through the window, reflecting off the badge on her desk. She picked it up, ran her thumb over the engraved emblem, and smiled faintly. That badge had once been a symbol of pride. Then it became a symbol of pain. But now it was something else, a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. Not for power, not for status, but for justice, she whispered to herself. Maybe this is what it was all meant for. Maybe it had to happen so something good could grow from it. And as she looked out at the city she had sworn to protect, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Because even though one arrest had exposed the cracks in the system, it had also opened the door for change. And she knew that sometimes the hardest moments in life are the ones that lead to the most meaningful change of all. Weeks turned into months, and the story of the captain's wrongful arrest continued to echo through the city. What had once been a single moment outside a department store had grown into something much larger. People from different communities began speaking up, sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment. Some were emotional, others quiet but powerful. The captain listened to them all. She had started attending community meetings not as an officer in uniform but as a listener. It was new for her, sitting among people who didn't always trust the badge she wore. She didn't defend the department or make promises she couldn't keep. She just listened. One evening in a small community center filled with folding chairs and the smell of coffee, a woman stood up to speak. Her voice trembled slightly as she said, "I used to tell my kids to go to the police if they were ever in trouble. But now, I tell them to be careful instead." The room went quiet. The captain felt that silence settle deep in her chest. She understood exactly what that mother meant. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up slowly. "I can't ask you to trust what you don't see," she said. "But I can promise that some of us are trying to make things better from the inside. I know words aren't enough. You need to see it in action. And I'm here to make sure that happens." There was no applause, just quiet nods. But that was enough. Real change didn't need loud moments, it needed honest ones. After that night, she began building something new. Together with a small group of dedicated officers and community leaders, she created a program where residents could meet local police in casual settings, parks, schools, coffee shops, just to talk. No uniforms, no badges, no titles, just people talking to people. At first, only a few showed up. But as weeks passed, more began to come. The conversations weren't always easy. Some were tense, some emotional, but every one of them mattered. One afternoon, during one of these meetings, an elderly man approached her. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think you all were the enemy. But after hearing what you went through, I realized you're human too. That's the part we forget." She smiled gently. "That's the part we all forget sometimes." Back at the station, she noticed subtle changes as well. Officers were beginning to talk differently. They asked more questions before jumping to conclusions. They took extra time with people instead of rushing through calls. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Yet not everyone was comfortable with the new direction. Some of the older officers complained that the department was being too soft. They said things like, "We can't worry about feelings when we're trying to do our job." She listened but didn't argue. Change was slow and not everyone would see it right away. But she knew that the real test of leadership wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about staying steady even when others didn't understand. Then one day, something unexpected happened. A call came through about a disturbance at a local convenience store. 2 young officers responded. When they arrived, they found a man pacing outside, angry and shouting. It could have gone wrong quickly, but instead of reacting with force, one of the officers spoke to him calmly, giving him space to explain. After a few minutes, the man sat down on the curb and everything de-escalated peacefully. When the report came in later, it was noted how the officers had shown restraint and understanding. That simple act caught the captain's attention. She called them into her office the next morning. "I read your report," she said. "You handled that call the way it should be handled, with patience." The younger of the two smiled nervously. "We just remembered what you said, ma'am." "Slow down, listen first," she nodded. "That's how you earn trust. Not through fear, but through respect." That evening, she sat in her car for a while before heading home. For the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet sense of peace. Maybe the work was starting to take root, but the peace didn't last long. A news outlet released an internal memo that discussed the department's bias training, suggesting it was a PR stunt. They claimed the city was just trying to clean up its image after her arrest went viral. The article spread quickly and the comments were harsh. Some accused her of doing it for attention. Others said the department was just pretending to care. It stung, not because of the criticism, but because she knew how hard people were actually working behind the scenes. That night, as she scrolled through the comments, she almost closed her laptop. But then she saw one message that stopped her. It read, "I was one of the officers who arrested her that day. I've learned more about respect in the last few months than in my whole career. The training she started isn't a stunt. It's a second chance for people like me to be better." She sat back and took a deep breath. The noise online didn't matter anymore. That message did. It meant that the work was changing lives, even if people couldn't see it from the outside. Over time, she became a quiet figure of hope in the city. Not a hero, not a celebrity, just someone who had lived through something painful and turned it into something meaningful. She spoke at police academies, at schools, and even at national conferences. But no matter how big the audience, her message stayed the same. Real justice begins when we see people before we see labels. Her words began to spread beyond the city. Other departments reached out, asking her to help them start similar programs. It was humbling and a little overwhelming, but she said yes. Because if her story could help even one department avoid the same mistakes, it was worth it. Still, there were nights when she couldn't sleep. She would think about that day in the store, the sound of the handcuffs closing, the faces of the people watching. The memory never fully faded. It became part of her, a quiet scar that reminded her why she was doing all this. One evening, she visited the same department store again. The place looked almost identical. The aisles, the smell, even the security guard near the door. But this time, when she walked in, she didn't feel anger or pain. She walked straight to the counter, bought a small gift card, and asked to speak to the store manager. When the manager came out looking nervous, she smiled gently and said, "I'm not here to complain. I just wanted to say that what happened here changed my life, and hopefully it's changing others too." The manager looked surprised. "You're the officer from the video, aren't you?" "Yes," she said. "But that's not what matters anymore. What matters is what we've all learned since then." She handed him the gift card. "Give this to someone who needs it," she said softly. Then she walked out, leaving him speechless. That small act of kindness wasn't about forgiveness. It was about closure. Later that night, she sat on her porch watching the city lights flicker. She thought about all the people she had met since that day. Officers, community members, students, and how each one had taught her something new about patience, courage, and humility. Change hadn't come easily, and it hadn't come fast, but it was happening, little by little. She could see it in the way people talked, in the way officers handled calls, in the way the community was beginning to breathe a little easier. The captain smiled to herself, feeling the cool night air against her face. She didn't need praise or headlines anymore. All she needed was the quiet truth that she had done something that mattered. The arrest that once embarrassed her had turned into a story of transformation, not just for her, but for an entire department and even beyond that, for anyone who believed in second chances. And as she sat there under the faint glow of a streetlight, she thought about how strange life could be, how something painful could become the very thing that opened hearts, started conversations, and built bridges where walls once stood. For the first time in months, she felt completely at peace. The journey wasn't over, but she no longer feared what lay ahead. She had faced humiliation, anger, and doubt, But out of all of it had come something beautiful, understanding. And sometimes, that's the greatest kind of justice there is. Months had passed since the day she walked out of that store with handcuffs on her wrists, but it still felt close, like a shadow that followed quietly behind her. Even after the public apologies, the internal reforms, and the new programs she had helped build, the captain knew the real work wasn't finished. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about everyone who came after. The department had changed in visible ways. Officers now attended open sessions with community members every month. There were conversations about empathy, about perspective, and about how to recognize bias before it turned into judgment. It wasn't easy and not everyone liked it, but she could feel a shift in the air. The uniform didn't carry the same wall it once did. There was a softer tone when people talked. Still, she often thought about what it had taken to get here. She would sit in her office sometimes, staring at the same badge she had worn for over 2 decades, thinking about the irony of how that small metal symbol could represent both pride and pain. The badge used to make her feel safe. It was supposed to mean honor and fairness. But on that day, when she stood in the parking lot being accused, the badge hadn't protected her at all. Now she saw it differently. The badge wasn't what gave a person respect. It was the choices behind it. One morning, she arrived at work early. The city was still quiet, the streets barely awake. She walked through the halls of the precinct, noticing the framed photos of past officers, old awards, and plaques that lined the walls. She had seen them 1,000 times before, but that morning they felt different. She wondered how many of those people had ever faced what she had. Probably none. In the break room, she made herself a cup of coffee. The aroma filled the air, and for a brief moment it felt peaceful. Then one of the younger officers walked in. He looked nervous, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. "Ma'am," he began quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've been doing," she smiled. "For what exactly?" He hesitated. "Before you started the new program, I used to think people were just angry at us for no reason. But after sitting through some of those sessions, I realized there are things we never saw, things we didn't even notice we were doing. I think we're getting better now," she nodded. "That's all I hoped for. Not perfection, just progress." He smiled back and walked away, and she watched him go, feeling something warm in her chest. It was small moments like that, quiet, genuine ones, that made all the struggle worth it. Later that day, she attended a meeting with city officials. They were reviewing the department's progress and discussing whether to expand the community program to neighboring cities. One official, an older man who had been skeptical from the start, spoke up. "I'll admit," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I didn't think this would last. I thought it was all talk. But it's working. The number of civilian complaints has dropped. People are showing up to meetings. You've changed how people see us." The captain didn't respond right away. She didn't want credit. She just wanted it to keep going. "It's not me," she finally said. "It's the people who decided to listen, on both sides." After the meeting, she stepped outside into the sunlight. The city was loud and alive, cars honking, people crossing the street, a food cart sizzling nearby. It all felt familiar, but somehow new at the same time. She walked toward a park where she often went to think. The same park where she had once spoken to community members under the shade of an old oak tree. Today, she sat on the same bench, quietly watching children chase a ball across the grass. A group of officers were nearby, talking with families, laughing even. It was something she hadn't seen often before. Real connection. She thought about how strange life could be. How something that once felt like the worst day of her life had turned into a door that opened to change. Maybe things really did happen for a reason, even when it didn't feel fair at the time. While she sat there, a woman approached her. She was holding a small notepad and a pen. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Are you the officer from that story, the one from the video?"